Western Europe is experiencing mass immigration, which is changing the look and feel of its societies. And European leaders seem to be encouraging this, making people ask why and where is it heading. And I'm going to address these questions through the lens of astrology. You see, human behaviour is shaped by mood, and astrology is about the way that mood is affected by cosmic cycles, like the 24-hour daily cycle, the yearly seasonal cycle, and the multi-thousand-year precessional cycle. So if we want to understand where the present mood in Europe comes from and how it will evolve, astrology can help us. Maybe. So in 1961, the fraction of London's population classified by the Office of National Statistics as white British, the fair-skinned people who trace their heritage back in Britain for many generations, was almost everyone, 98%. In 2021, it was only 37%. That is a massive demographic and cultural shift in less than a lifetime. For the whole of England and Wales, the white British population is 74%, from 81% in 2011 and 88% in 2001. In Europe, the proportion of native Europeans was 80% in 2021 and 77.6% in 2024, down 2.4% in just 3 years. So yes, there has been a shift. It's still happening and it's rapid. And what's key is that the proportion of new Europeans has reached a critical mass. The influx overwhelms the capacity of society to assimilate the newcomers. The new Europeans don't have to adapt to the host culture. They can live, work, shop, socialise, get married, all within their own communities. This is because the migrant populations are not distributed uniformly, and locally the concentration of newcomers can be very high, 100%. This map from the Office of National Statistics shows the proportion of white British across England and Wales. Dark blue means a high proportion of white British, with less than 10% newcomers. The lighter and greener the colour, the higher the proportion of newcomers. So in the light green patches, newcomers dominate at around 65 to 85% of the population. It's the rural areas that are largely white British, while the newcomers are concentrated in urban areas like London, Birmingham, and the more northerly heartlands of the Industrial Revolution. And this separation into what we can call Old European and New European areas will only become more accentuated. The sociologist Thomas Schelling showed that it only takes a small tendency for people to gravitate to their own kind to end up with total segregation. Now, for the last few centuries, the political ideal in Western Europe was the nation-state. One state, one nation, meaning a people with a shared culture and a shared sense of identity. Yes, there were always minorities or regional identities, but one culture dominated. Now, this ideal is being replaced with a new ideal, multiculturalism, a society of multiple cultures, different religions, different clothing, different diets, a different sense of identity. And the former host culture is to become just another culture within this patchwork. And I say this is a new ideal because Europe's elites, politicians, the media, intellectuals, business leaders, the people with social power, in other words, promote it as a goal. Diversity is our strength. DEI programs favouring newcomers, a persistent failure to limit illegal immigration that looks deliberate. And at the same time, there is a perception that things like Christmas or the national flag are toned down or abolished, downgrading the native culture. The elites don't just look at this map as a fact. The white British areas are seen as a problem. It is said the countryside is too white, and there are plans to make it less white. So there's an agenda at work, and it's pushed by the old European governments and institutions, even if some of the newcomers are jumping on the bandwagon. And that's a clue that we're dealing with a mood, not an accident, but a social mood propelling Europe towards multiculturalism. And in multicultural societies, politics tends to become tribal or sectarian. People vote in the interests of their own ethnic or cultural community. Politicians advocate for their community against the others. This is the way it has been in Northern Ireland, with parties representing either Protestant or Catholic, and very little cutting across that divide. In the last UK election, 4 MPs, more or less explicitly representing Muslim interests, were elected in constituencies with high Muslim populations. And there is the recently founded Restore Britain, a nativist party, more or less explicitly appealing to the white British, so more a symptom of sectarianism than its solution. And then the transformation of Europe by incoming communities is not just a numbers game. The incomers have more vigour and confidence than the indigenous population. This picture shows the summer 2024 crop of newly qualified barristers, the people who will supply the UK's future judges: Mohammed Kashif Riaz, Repon Mir, Shantanu Dev, Yusuf Ali. Those are the first few names on the list, and such names outnumber traditionally British names by something like 10 to 1. Muslims and other newcomers are getting ahead, embarking on careers of power and influence. The white British, not so much. Indigenous Europeans seem unorganised, even demoralised, though they get behind parties and leaders that promise to restore their fortunes, and those parties even do pretty well. It's never quite enough, and nothing seems to change. I know there are those who believe Restore Britain will turn things around and everything will be all right. But the precedents are not good, and neither is the big picture, or the astrological picture, as we will come to. Britain's capital and its second largest city are majority newcomer or heading that way. You know, all your bases are belong to us. It's not clear that voting, what worked in the 20th century, is going to change this. The survival of indigenous culture is going to require other means, because it's bigger than electoral politics. Institutions like the monarchy and the church, that would traditionally provide the core and focus of indigenous identity, are moving in the opposite direction, no longer reliable, and you can't reach them through the ballot box. As those institutions lose legitimacy and relevance, there's a need for new institutions to replace them, and that requires a whole other kind of activity and strategy. And arrayed against this is the confidence of the newcomers that I've referred to. And really, I mean the confidence of the Islamic community, which is cohesive and ambitious with clear goals. And just to be clear, Muslim is not a race, and they can recruit from all ethnicities. So I'd contrast them, for example, with what the Office of National Statistics calls blacks, people of sub-Saharan African heritage, who are not organised around a clear cultural ideology and don't present a challenge at the civilizational level. And similarly, other communities are less numerous or have more values in common with traditional Europeans, or just tend to keep themselves to themselves. But Muslims are well organised with a distinctive cultural outlook, and they are assertive, building mosques, constructing parallel legal systems, promoting their cultural practices like halal slaughter. It's not all one way, of course, as France has banned the burqa and female genital mutilation is strictly illegal in the UK. But the direction of travel is for a growing presence of Islam in European life. So mainstream projections suggest that the proportion of Muslims in the UK will be around 15 to 20% by 2050. In History and Mathematics, David Coleman calculates that half the UK population will be non-white British by 2070, which might be an overestimate. If we look at this chart showing the percentage of white British by birth year, although it declines rapidly from 1950 to 1980, it actually bounces back a bit and is fairly steady for the last 30 years. So things may not be changing quite as fast as some have predicted, though continued adult immigration could change this chart, And anyway, white British could be converting to Islam, so a chart of ethnicity doesn't tell the whole story. This other chart of the growth of the actual Muslim population from 1961 to 2011 suggests it might reach just under 35% by 2100, a third of the population. And for Western Europe as a whole, in a paper from 2016, Hussein Katani presents this chart of the growth of Muslim population from 1900 to 2100. It accelerated up till around 2010, that's actual data, and after that he has it going up more slowly, reaching 14% by 2100. In this case, maybe an underestimate. Demographics like these are like a supertanker, in that the grandparents of the youth of 2100 have already been born. So while a miracle might occur, the probability is that Europe's demographic and cultural shift will only increase, and its former indigenous peoples, the old Europeans, may not even be the largest or strongest group by some time in the next century. So the question is why? Why is it happening, and why are Europe's elites not just insouciant about it, but positively in favour of it, or so it seems? Now, I know there are explanations in terms of bringing in workers to pay for the retirement of European pensioners, or in terms of the Kalergi plan and the activities of people like Barbara Lerner-Spector. But such things can only have an effect because of deeper changes in European society. In 732, Charles Martel drove back a Muslim invasion at the Battle of Tours. If Muslims are now heading towards 20% of the population, it's because Europeans deal with these things differently. There has been a change of mood. And I'm not just repeating a meme here, I'm the author of this article from 2009, The Early Christian Insurgency in Islamic Spain, in the Journal of Small Wars and Insurgencies. So the time of Charles Martel is a period I know well. But anyway, as Tolstoy said in War and Peace, history is the swarm life of humanity. It's a mass phenomenon driven by somewhat mysterious forces. You can't pin it on this or that person. We like to say Columbus discovered America because it's easy, but it was really about a whole range of world historical trends, population growth, technological advances, improved communications, geopolitical developments blocking trade routes to the Far East, the increased prosperity of European consumers, and maybe other things. These structural factors are what led Europeans to cross the Atlantic and feel their way out into the world. So when Charles Martel defeated the Muslim forces, it wasn't just about him. It was about the attitudes of Europeans at that time. And what's happening in Europe today is not just about the machinations of individuals. It's about structural changes in European society and the world that allow it to happen. And so to understand the why, it makes sense to look at patterns of historical change. And insofar as cosmic cycles influence changes of social mood, at astrology. So if we go back to Katani's article, History and Prospect of Muslims in Western Europe, he has a zoomed out version of his graph of Muslim population, and it shows Western Europe's Muslim population was much higher in the past, 1,000 odd years ago. So what's happening today could be considered a rebound. Yes, then Muslim population was concentrated in the Iberian Peninsula, and today it's more spread out. But that's only because Charles Martel won his battle. In big picture terms, Islamic influence on Europe rose and fell, and now it's rising again. So we seem to have a cycle, maybe a cosmic cycle. And if Britain is moving towards cultural fragmentation, as this map suggests, it's only returning towards the way it was after the fall of the Roman Empire, when it was divided into numerous petty kingdoms, which were only knitted together after long struggles. So we may be looking at another cyclical pattern. And I've called Europe's fair-skinned people the old Europeans, or the indigenous people, or we could call them Christians, but those terms are all relative. Europeans weren't always Christian, for example. nor did they invent Christianity. Christianity is a religion imported from the Middle East, where Islam also comes from. And similarly, the English are only indigenous to Britain if we start the clock 1500 to 2000 years ago. Well, they are a mix of Anglo-Saxon immigrants, the earlier British population, and people who came later, like the Vikings. But their own mythology says they came from northern Germany after the Romans left Britain. But sure, they are indigenous relative to the communities that only arrived in significant numbers from the middle of the last century. And then the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas used the term Old Europe for the Neolithic goddess-worshipping societies that occupied the continent before the arrival of male-dominated Indo-European speakers from the Eurasian steppe around 4000 BC. So for Maria Gimbutas, the people I've called the Old Europeans are the New Europeans. So you see, the relativeness of these terms means we seem to be looking at recurring patterns that operate according to cosmic timetables. And immigration was a big controversy in England in the 17th century. Only in those days it was about people moving from poorer parts of the British Isles to the prosperous southeast. The local parishes then had to pay for the upkeep of these poor immigrants, which caused animosity. The Irish were particularly resented as a subhuman race of criminals that bred like rabbits. But why was this happening? Well, several reasons. The medieval laws tying people to their villages had been abolished. Economic growth had benefited some areas more than others because of geography or new technology, and the spread of printing meant news travelled faster, so people were better aware of opportunities elsewhere. And the road network had been improved, so it was easier to get there. So increased mobility and increased incentives made it inevitable that Britain's population would move around, causing anger at the time, but ultimately creating a more connected country. And today we live in a world of instant global communications and jet planes getting you anywhere on the planet in 24 hours. And this is after the so-called Great Divergence, when Europe's economic growth outstripped the rest of the world's. So there were strong reasons to migrate to Europe, and it's become very easy. Trying to keep people confined to their regions would be like trying to keep people confined to their regions in 17th century England. It's swimming against the tide of history. Think of an electric circuit. There's a potential difference or voltage between the two sides of the battery, making a current flow, and a resistance that limits the current. Well, Europe's wealth relative to the rest of the world creates a large potential difference, and improvements in transport and communication mean the resistance has drastically decreased. So large potential difference, low resistance, inevitably there is a high flow from poor to rich. So here is a structural reason for newcomers arriving in Europe. It's not about people manipulating things, it's about world historical processes, which is not to say that people aren't manipulating things, but it only works because the current wants to flow in that direction anyway. So people who want to stop the flow can talk about remigration and share memes, but it's like trying to push the electrons back up the wire. Sure, you can do a better job of securing your borders, which is like increasing the resistance, but you're not going to be able to keep the distribution of the world's population the way it was in 1950 or 2026, or whatever your preferred baseline is. It's never stood still in the past. It's not going to do so in future. It will flow the way the circuit makes it. So we're looking at history in real time, and we can't expect to live on this planet and not experience historical change. Europe and Europeans are entering a new phase of their existence, but it's not the end of the world. The end of Western civilization, maybe, but otherwise just a new situation with new challenges. So instead of wishing for times that have gone and will never come back, it's more useful to look forward and understand the times that are coming and the challenges they will present. and astrology will be our guide. Now, I gave a bit of a primer on astrology in another video, so here we'll stick to essentials. So, due to the precession of the equinoxes, the world moves through a series of astrological ages, each lasting around 2,000 years. It has been in the age of Pisces for the last 2,000 years and is now heading into the age of Aquarius. So here are the 12 signs of the zodiac, and every year we cycle through them. That is, the sun moves through the constellations from Aries to Pisces. And then the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation, produces a much longer cycle of 26,000 years called the Great Year, which moves the date of the spring equinox through the signs in the opposite direction. So from the age of Pisces, the world moves to the age of Aquarius, and after that the age of Capricorn. And before the age of Pisces, the world was in the age of Aries, and before that the age of Taurus, and so on, changing every 2,000 years, I said earlier, or 2,150 years to be more precise. Now, each sign has a particular character. So Pisces is the mystic, say, and the sign's character sets the overall character of the world age. For Aquarius, it's known as the maverick, and it's also associated with the idea of the collective, collective life, collectivism. We also divide signs into cardinal, fixed and mutable, where for world ages cardinal is foundational, as was the age of Aries, when many institutions we still use like money came in. Mutable, like the age of Pisces, implies a time of frequent change, and fixed implies lack of change, and Aquarius is fixed. And each sign also has a ruling planet, and for Aquarius it's Saturn. And because Saturn is yellowish and the slowest moving of the pre-telescopic planets known to the ancients, it is considered like an old man and is associated with being weighed down by life and lack of dynamism. Putting these things together, the age of Aquarius is seen as a time of stagnation, stability, authoritarian government, heavy-handed bureaucracy, lack of freedom and collectivism, the hive mind, communism. But because Aquarius is a kind of schizophrenic sign representing the collective and the maverick, the age of Aquarius will also be a time that shines on unconventional thinking and underground intellectual resistance. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, it seemed for a while that communism had been defeated, just a failed experiment of the 20th century. Francis Fukuyama proposed the end of history thesis, meaning that politico-economic struggles were over and one system, liberal democracy, had emerged as the winner. But communism wasn't defeated. Not only does the Chinese Communist Party rule over a large fraction of humanity, but people in the West are still attracted to communist ideas. And what didn't kill communism has made it stronger. China's regime studied the fall of the Soviet Union and adjusted course to avoid the same mistakes. And this is what we can expect in the age of Aquarius, ever more effective totalitarian systems with powerful mechanisms of surveillance and control, allowing some freedoms but swift to eliminate threats to the political order. We could regard today's feeling that voting doesn't change anything as a sign of this Aquarian ethos, when government is about control, not about representation or response to the will of the people. So these characteristics of the Aquarian age, which apply to the whole world, certainly clash with European traditions of independence and eccentricity, and suggest it will be an uncomfortable time for the European civilizational soul. But what we would like is to know the specific astrological influences on Europe during this time. And for that we will turn to the Tetrabiblos, meaning 4 books, of Claudius Ptolemy, the map maker and astrologer who lived in Egypt in the 2nd century AD. So Ptolemy divides the world, the Old World, into 4 quadrants. The north-south divide goes through the Mediterranean, then along the boundary between the Great Steppe of northern Eurasia and the more humid, congested lands to the south. The east-west divide runs from Finland down through the Caucasus and into the Persian Gulf, or as some call it, the Arabian Gulf. The northwest quadrant then corresponds to Europe, the northeast quadrant to Eurasia, Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, and the Central Asian republics. The southeast quadrant is East and South Asia, basically China and India, and the southwest quadrant corresponds to MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, including the Upper Nile, which was sometimes ruled by the pharaohs. Ptolemy's division is slightly different to what I have here, in that he includes everything east of the Mediterranean in the southeast quadrant, but the essential unity of the MENA region, which is clear from subsequent history, makes it natural to recognise it as one quadrant. This corresponds to what Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West called the Magian civilization, again recognising its unity. It's also the Arabic-speaking world. In fact, there is an argument for extending it east as far as Pakistan, representing the contiguous Islamic world. This map of family structure types by Emmanuel Todd shows it represents a distinct culture area. In fact, all 4 quadrants tend to come out in this map, with the exception that exogamous extended kinship, coloured red on the map, seems less clearly diagnostic. Anyway, while extending the southwest quadrant sideways leaves the east-west divide with a kink in it, Ptolemy never insisted that the divides go strictly along great circles, and we can regard the cultural and physical coherence of the quadrants as a more significant criterion than arbitrary grid lines. Now, Ptolemy's scheme doesn't include the Western Hemisphere, which he didn't know about, but later on I'm going to suggest how we can extend it to the Americas. And nor did Ptolemy include sub-Saharan Africa, and in this case I'm also going to leave it out, which I'll justify on the grounds that DNA studies have shown there is a fundamental divide between sub-Saharan peoples and everyone else. Specifically, only those outside of Africa have Neanderthal ancestry. So I'll say for convenience that Ptolemy's astrology only applies to those who have inherited the imaginative world of the Neanderthals, as described by the fringe archaeologist Stan Gooch. So really, sub-Saharan Africans need a different treatment, which could be an interesting project, but isn't relevant here because we're focusing on Europe. True, people of African heritage are coming into Europe, but they can be seen as an outside influence, not part of the system itself. Their presence is disruptive, but not transformative at the civilizational level. Okay, now Ptolemy assigns different astrological influences to the different quadrants. This is based on the qualities of the winds from the respective directions. So to the ancients, the north wind, say, was a drying wind, while south winds were hot and west winds were moist. And we can update this with modern ideas about climate. So in the north, winds blow west to east, which means in the west they have come over ocean and are full of moisture, making these lands wet. But in the east they have come over land and are dry, making these lands arid. In the south winds blow the opposite way, so the east is wet and the west more arid. And then we can add to this that the north is colder and the south is hotter, and we get the 4 quadrants as cold wet, cold dry, hot wet and hot dry. And that's a quick and dirty view of it. And the point is that climate affects humans' attitudes and behaviour. For example, climate affects what crops will grow and how well they grow, and that affects society's ability to feed themselves, so affecting population density and economic practices and technological choices, which in turn affects social institutions, for example, with denser populations requiring stronger mechanisms of social control to suppress conflict and exploitation. And this interaction of climate and culture is explored by Felipe Fernandez Armesto in his book Civilizations, where he divides societies into those of the steppes, forest lands, island chains, etc. So climate can affect social organisation, mood, behaviour, and the historical experience and global role of different regions. And this is what the astrology is basically describing. So we have 4 quadrants with different characteristics, and Ptolemy assigns them different astrological triplicities. What's that? Well, here's the 12 signs of the zodiac, and astrologers divide them into 4 groups of 3, or 4 triplicities. Fire, consisting of Aries, Leo and Sagittarius. Earth, consisting of Taurus, Virgo and Capricorn. Air, consisting of Gemini, Libra and Aquarius. And water, consisting of Cancer, Scorpio and Pisces. And Ptolemy assigns them to the quadrants with fire in the northwest, air in the northeast, earth in the southeast and water in the southwest. Okay, so Europe is assigned Aries the warrior, Leo the artist or creator, and Sagittarius the explorer. Well, what has been the historical role of Europe over the last 2,000 years since Ptolemy? It's certainly been a warlike continent, constantly at war with itself and going on to project military force around the world. So Aries the warrior seems to fit. It's also been highly creative, modern science, electricity, penicillin and countless other inventions. So Leo the creator works. And it's also been the quadrant of exploration, discovery of the new world, routes to the Far East, the North Pole, South Pole, deepest Africa. That's Sagittarius all over. So yes, warrior, creator, explorer. Those sum up Europe's historical character pretty well. And these are the fire signs. So we could say Europe has been on fire over recent centuries. What about the northeast quadrant? This is air, so Gemini the messenger, signifying communication and travel, mobility. Then Libra the diplomat, the balancer, the sign of intermediation, the go-between, and the sign of exchange or trade. And Aquarius again, the sign of the collective, but also of the maverick, which means the sign of ideas, new ideas, unorthodox ideas. And what all this is describing is the world historical role of the northeast as the quadrant of the Silk Roads, implying far-flung travel, exchange between east and west, transmitting not just merchandise, but also philosophy and world religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, new ideas, and also as the quadrant of the great mobile empires of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde of Genghis's grandson, and the empire of Tamerlane. These were not based on static governments like in China, say, but on mobile armies roaming across vast spaces, and they connected East Asia with the West, facilitating the flow of people, goods and ideas, classic air-like intermediation. and their power was based on control of these flows, extracting value from trade and communication, all very air. Okay, so now the southeast quadrant ruled by the earth signs. Well, Taurus the sensualist is about productivity, material abundance, pleasure, wealth, luxury. It's an earth sign, and production comes from the earth, wealth comes from the earth. And this has been the southeast's world historical role as a source of pepper and cotton goods, and particularly as a source of luxuries, silk, porcelain, spices, tea, things that appeal through their beauty or their taste and texture. In other words, through their sensual qualities, which is Taurus to the bone. As for Virgo the healer, this is not just about physical healing in the narrow sense, but is about cultivation of well-being, which includes spiritual health, self-maintenance and general vitality. We can see this in traditional Chinese medicine and India's Ayurveda, an ancient system of wellness. In this quadrant, health was treated holistically. It has given us things like yoga and Tai Chi, health as a practice, a general cultivation of well-being, very different from Western medicine, which is technological, calling in the doctor only when you're actually ill. Western medicine talks of fighting infection and the war on cancer. The body is seen as a battleground between doctors and germs, which is what we might expect for a quadrant influenced by Aries the warrior. But in the southeast quadrant, the influence of Virgo means the body is a garden to be tended, and not just the body, but body, mind, spirit, the whole person, for example, with transcendental meditation. And the third earth sign is Capricorn the ruler, which is about structure or structured power, law, hierarchy. And earth brings in ideas about groundedness, fixity and weighty matter. So this is the quadrant of powerful, ponderous, static societies based on control of immobile production. In China we have the imperial bureaucracy. In India we have the hierarchical caste system, both very rigid, very orderly, expressing the Capricornian themes of rule and structure. These are earth empires, drawing their power from mass production, the peasants working in the fields and rice paddies, very different from the fluid, mobile empires of the air quadrant that were based on control of exchange and movement. And lastly, we have the southwest quadrant governed by water signs. So Cancer is the nurturer, the sign of home and family. On this map of family structure, it is the region of extended families with endogamy, meaning people marry within their kin group. That is how important family is to them. It contrasts with European nuclear families of just parents and children, who may live far apart from cousins, siblings or grandparents and have little to do with them. Then Scorpio is the alchemist, which is considered the sign of transformation and is associated with esoteric, hidden matters, the occult. Well, this is the quadrant where alchemy and astrology came from, which then became chemistry and astronomy when they reached the pragmatic, mundane culture of Leo-Sagittarian Europe. And Pisces is the mystic, concerned with the divine, things above and beyond, transcendent reality. And this quadrant was the source of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that spread from there over the last 2 millennia. And in this respect, note that although Jewish religion goes back to the Bronze Age, modern Judaism can be considered as a reformulation that emerged more recently, particularly in Alexandria during Roman times. So anyway, water signs are about what's deep, what's hidden, what's below the surface. So they evoke the mysteries of life, or the afterlife, the world we don't see. With Cancer's family ties, Scorpio's esotericism, and Pisces' mysticism, we are in the realms of religion, the religious side of life, dealing with what binds people together, with spiritual supernatural truths, and with cosmic pattern and destiny. So we should hardly be surprised that this quadrant has given us the great faith communities of Christendom, the Muslim Ummah, and the Jewish diaspora. So there we have it. Ptolemy's characterization of the four quadrants maps well to their world historical roles over the age of Pisces. The northwest, Europe, fire signs, the quadrant of militarism, invention, exploration. The northeast, Eurasia, air signs, the quadrant of exchange, communication, mobility. The southeast, China, India, earth signs, the quadrant of production, hierarchy, well-being. The southwest, Mena, water signs, the quadrant of esotericism, faith, community. Now, Ptolemy actually goes further by seeing his scheme as fractal. So the northwest quadrant, for example, can be subdivided into four further quadrants following the same pattern. The overall theme is fire, but the northeast part has an air aspect. We can think of the Vikings, a civilization based not so much on static cities, but on far-flung roaming and trading across the seas and rivers of the old world. Similarly, the southeast of Europe is earth-like, source of wine and olive oil. The southwest is watery, scene of a long confrontation between Islam, Judaism and Catholicism. And the northwest is fire within fire, the fiery part of the fire quadrant, which is why it was northwest Europe that stood out in terms of militarism, invention and exploration. Think of the British Empire, the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain, and the role of British explorers in New Zealand, Australia and North America, leaving them English-speaking to this day. And France and the Netherlands, also part of northwest Europe, were not far behind. Well, we won't go into this much detail here, but this idea of a fractal subdivision could explain why different parts of Europe are moving in different directions, with Eastern Europe, say, less affected by mass migration and multiculturalism. So that's the way the quadrants have been in the past, but what about the future? Well, for this we can use the idea of the precession of the equinoxes. So as we've seen, the world moves through different ages, going backwards through the signs of the zodiac. And while the precise timing is debatable, we're around the time that the age of Pisces is turning into the age of Aquarius. It's not like a sudden jump. The ages merge into each other, and the world is becoming less Piscean and more Aquarian, more about powerful governments, collectivism, stagnation, and underground intellectual resistance. Now, the precession of the equinoxes results from the changing orientation of the Earth relative to the plane of the ecliptic, the plane of the zodiac. And Ptolemy's assignment of star signs to quadrants involves mapping from the celestial zodiac to terrestrial geography. So as the Earth shifts relative to the heavens, we should expect that the mapping from celestial pattern to terrestrial pattern should change at the same time. And since the precession of the equinoxes involves slipping back through the signs of the zodiac, we should expect each of the signs attributed to each quadrant to slip back too. So here's the fire triplicity, consisting of the signs Aries, Leo and Sagittarius. And as we move into the next great month, the next age of the world, these are each going to slip back by one sign. So Aries goes to Pisces, Leo goes to Cancer, and Sagittarius goes to Scorpio. And this is the water triplicity. So with each turn of the great year, roughly every 2,000 years, the fire triplicity changes to the water triplicity. As for the water triplicity, when this slips back by one, it goes from Pisces, Cancer, Scorpio to Aquarius, Gemini, Libra, which is air. And when these air signs slip back one, they become the earth signs, Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus. And lastly, when the earth signs slip back one, they become Sagittarius, Leo, Aries, in other words, fire. So when the astrological age changes, the fire quadrant becomes water, the water quadrant becomes air, the air quadrant becomes earth, and the earth quadrant becomes fire. So here is why old Europeans, the indigenous Europeans, are feeling an uncomfortable sense of their civilization changing, disappearing, being transformed, losing its nerve, losing its verve, destroying itself from the top down as the elites betray its former values. It's because their continent is turning from fire to water. So for 2,000 years, Europe was on fire, favouring innovation, exploration, warrior values. Europeans came to think that was the natural way for them to be, that it would be Europe's role forever. But everything moves in cycles. What was fire must turn to water. And Europeans who regret this civilizational shift are responding by turning back to the past. They are evoking the spirit of the warrior, dreaming of a Christian revival. This kind of reaffirmation of core principles is a typical response of human groups whose worldview is under stress. A classic anthropological example is the North American Indian ghost dance, a doubling down on traditional cultural ideas in response to the civilizational challenge of European settlers. Similarly, when political parties lose badly, they often elect radical leaders rallying around the very values that cost them the election. So yes, as Europeans face the disappearance of the world they knew, they are reaching for the values of the fire triplicity, Aries, Leo and Sagittarius, not recognizing that those signs aren't working for them anymore. Their future lies under the influence of water signs, Cancer the nurturer, the sign of the family, so the sign of heritage and historical memory, because family implies heritage and heritage implies historical memory. And Scorpio, the alchemist, so esotericism, not mind, body, spirit, new age type thinking, which is more Virgo, but arcane things, secret knowledge, the occult, magical transformation of matter. And lastly, Pisces the mystic, so deep spiritual inquiry, journeys to the beyond, exploration of other planes of existence, and above all, new insights into the cosmos, what it is, and what it all means. Now, for those who hope to restore the good old days when Europe was heroic, homogeneous, and high-achieving, it may seem wrong and defeatist to say this is just a pipe dream, and instead Europe's going to turn all spiritual and into magical mumbo-jumbo. Well, yes, what I'm arguing could be wrong, but it's not defeatist. The first step towards overcoming problems is to understand them, avoid wishful thinking, face up to reality, get to the truth. Europeans can look at images like this and say, we love that, we're proud of that. But that was yesterday. That was the last chapter. This is the next chapter. New challenges, new solutions. Not obvious or easy, We're entering new territory. There will be difficulties, but it's overcoming difficulties that gives life meaning. You see, Ptolemy's ideas fit the historical evidence rather well. This suggests his scheme is not arbitrary. It has something to teach us, and not just about the past, but about the future. Even if at the end of the day we say, well, that's a possible future, but we're going to change it. The point is that the astrological ideas can sharpen the understanding and pinpoint the issues. So instead of stumbling into the future naive and dreaming, we know the ambushes coming up and we can meet them armed with the right weapons. So notice how while Europeans are disoriented by the shift from fire to water, the people migrating into Europe from the Islamic world are going from water to water. Europeans feel their fire being drowned, if you like, in the new watery milieu of their continent, and it's a shock to the system. But for the newcomers, this is precisely what they're used to. They've been underwater for the last 2,000 years. Their attitudes, their culture, their way of life, their whole outlook on the world are all nicely suited for a water situation. While the old Europeans are struggling to adapt, the new Europeans don't have to. While the old Europeans feel their world moving away from them, to the new Europeans it feels like home. The new Europeans are coming into Europe just as the turning of the great year is bringing it a new mood that matches their strengths. No wonder they are confident. No wonder they are smoothly moving into positions of power and influence, while the old Europeans complain from the sidelines, retreating into comforting ideas of identitarianism and turning back the tide of history. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that Europe is experiencing large-scale immigration at precisely this time when Europeans are faced with this cosmic shift. Great migrations always seem to occur when the astrological age is changing. So here is the timing of astrological ages with a 2,150-year duration for each one. And I've noted the triplicity applying to the different quadrants in each age. So the Indo-European migration, or Kurgan invasion, that brought an end to Maria Gimbutas's Old Europe occurred around 4,400 BC, just as the age of Gemini was turning into the age of Taurus. There was a change in Europe's genetic makeup at this time, pointing to population replacement. The Kurgan people came from steppe lands north of the Caucasus in the northeast quadrant, then under Earth influence, and they were in the southwest part of this quadrant, which was then associated with air. So they were an Earth-air people. And in fact, the Kurgans seem to have been formed from people moving up from the southwest some 1,000 years earlier, in the first half of the Age of Gemini, as in this diagram, which refers to the Yamnaya part of the Kurgan culture. So these would be people coming from the northeast corner of the southwest quadrant, who would therefore be air with a secondary earth influence. So the Kurgan invaders were a mix of earth and air. The earth aspect is suggested by the great earthworks known as kurgans that give their name to the culture. The air aspect is suggested by their high mobility as riders and charioteers who brought the horse and the wheel to Europe. And similar to today, this air aspect would have meant they were pre-adapted to Europe's new air triplicity, which the old Europeans at that time were struggling to adjust to. Then before this, the Cancer to Gemini transition around 6600 BC can be associated with the arrival of so-called early European farmers from Turkey into Europe. This produced almost total population replacement, 98%. Like today, the EEFs were coming from water in the southwest to a new water environment in the northwest, just as the indigenous European hunter-gatherers were adjusting to the change of triplicity. Then the move from Taurus to Aries coincides with the 4.2 kiloyear event, an abrupt climatic shift around 2200 BC that saw the collapse of several complex societies and seems to have been a time of mass migration. The Amorites from northern Syria moved into the Tigris-Euphrates basin, establishing their rule over the Middle East, while the Indo-Aryan people migrated from Central Asia into India. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, an Egyptian text from this time, complains about foreigners coming into Egypt as the northern border has broken down, and says they are outnumbering the indigenous Egyptians and are making them second-class citizens in their own land. And the most recent transition from Aries to Pisces can be linked to the Volkerwanderung, the wandering of peoples, the barbarian migrations that eventually brought down the Roman Empire. Around 110 BC, there was the Cimbrian War, caused by tribes migrating into Gaul from the north, and in 58 BC, an attempted migration by the Helvetii tribe towards western Gaul kicked off Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And these movements continued through the early centuries of the Piscean Age. In the 2nd century, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign fending off Germanic tribes, but they entered the empire anyway as economic migrants, building up their numbers. So although the barbarian invasions are typically seen as occurring around the 400s AD, this was really the end of the process, when the barbarian incomers had attained cultural dominance and political ascendancy. So yes, each shift of the Great Year seems to be associated with mass population movements, and the Age of Aquarius just fits that pattern. Now, it might be thought, well, won't Europe's new water triplicity just cause the old Europeans and the new Europeans to coalesce into a single Kalergi-esque composite? Or could the fair-skinned peoples, the old Europeans, even disappear? After all, the invasions of the early European farmers and the Kurgan culture, or even the Anglo-Saxons into Britain, resulted in population replacement. Well, maybe not. Maybe the indigenous Europeans can retain their identity and distinctiveness. And Ptolemy gives us a way to tackle this question, because as well as assigning triplicities to each quadrant, he also assigns a pair of planets, and these can be taken to represent not the territory per se, but the people, the indigenous people of each quadrant. So traditional astrology recognizes 7 planets, including the sun and moon, as things that move about the sky. And of these, Jupiter and Venus are considered benefic or good planets, while Saturn and Mars are considered malefic or bad planets. So Jupiter, as chief of the gods, represents personal sovereignty, self-rule, autonomy, the ego, the individual, things like that. Venus, as the planet of beauty and love, is about the comforts of social life, interpersonal relations, community, relationships with loved ones. Saturn, as the slow old man of the solar system, represents social obligations, hierarchy, heavy-handed authority, bureaucracy, sluggishness. And Mars, the red planet, is about vigour, self-assertion, aggression and dynamism. And then the remaining 3 planets are neutral to benefic. Mercury, the fastest moving planet that darts around the sky, is about communication. The Sun, naturally, is about brightness, energy, warmth, visibility, and the Moon is about reflection, the light in the darkness, night, dreams, memory. Then Ptolemy assigns 1 benefic and 1 malefic planet to each quadrant. The northwest quadrant is ruled by Mars and Jupiter, the northeast by Jupiter and Saturn, the southeast by Saturn and Venus, and the southwest by Venus and Mars. And we can see Ptolemy's scheme. Jupiter rules the north while Venus rules the south, and Saturn rules the east while Mars rules the west. Now, while the triplicities describe the temporary character of each quadrant during a given astrological age, the planets seem to describe the more permanent character of the people who live there, or the kind of society or culture that they construct. We can surmise this because there is no simple relationship between the triplicities and the planetary rulers. They are determined by different principles. So each zodiac sign has a planetary ruler of its own. We've already seen that Aquarius is ruled by the malefic Saturn, which is what makes us think of it as an oppressive sign of heavy-handed government. And this table shows each quadrant's ruling signs with their corresponding planets, as well as the pair of planets assigned to each quadrant. So for the northwest, the planets of the triplicity are Mars, Sun and Jupiter, while the planetary pair assigned to the quadrant is Mars and Jupiter. So in this case, if we ignore the Sun, it looks like a correspondence. For the northeast quadrant, the triplicity gives Mercury, Venus and Saturn, while the assigned pair consists of Jupiter and Saturn. So in this case, although the triplicity includes Venus, the assigned benefic planet is Jupiter, so no definite correspondence. For the southeast quadrant, there is another match, but for the southwest quadrant, only 1 planet is the same again. And since we're dealing with a limited number of planets, the partial matches could be coincidental. So we return to the point that the planets assigned to a quadrant do not reflect its triplicity, so should not necessarily be expected to change when the triplicity changes, and are a more stable characteristic of the people and their culture. So now let's see what the ruling planets say about each quadrant's culture. Well, the 2 eastern quadrants are ruled by Saturn, implying strong authoritarian government. In the north, this is combined with Jupiter, which is the planet of the ego, the individual, and which seems to describe how in the northeast quadrant we have the Tsardoms and the Khanates, Genghis Khan, Peter the Great, strong egos, individual autocrats, rulers with personal power. Whereas in the south, Saturn is paired with Venus, suggesting more socially embedded forms of power. And so in China we see the imperial bureaucracy, or today the Communist Party equivalent, with power distributed through this managerial hierarchy. And in India we see the caste system providing a rigid social ordering and culturally embedded method of control. In the West, the malefic influence is from Mars, not Saturn, so no tendency towards massive monolithic hierarchies, and instead societies that exhibit more fluid political struggles, internecine conflict, and a general propensity for war and aggression. In the north, there is again the influence of Jupiter, so individualistic with an emphasis on personal freedom and independence. In the south, Mars is paired with Venus, meaning that social networks are important, especially family relationships. So you have a tribal or clan society based around kinship. And a brief aside, what Ptolemy's assignment of planets seems to pick up on is that the north had less dense populations, favouring individualism, while the south had more dense populations, favouring a more social outlook, i.e. Jupiter versus Venus. And similarly, the flat plains of the east favoured more expansive governments, while the rugged terrain of the west, broken by seas and mountains, favoured more local rule, leading to frequent antagonism, i.e. Saturn versus Mars. So it turns out that of all the quadrants, only the northwest is truly individualistic, valuing freedom and expressing Martian vigour along with a Jovian or Jupiterian desire for self-rule. And these qualities are described by Oswald Spengler as the Faustian spirit of Western civilization, after the myth of Dr. Faust, who sold his soul to the devil in return for knowledge. The Faustian spirit is fundamentally inquisitive, ego-driven, and oriented towards mastery over nature. The other three quadrants are all collectivist in some way. The southwest is characterised by social collectivism. People are controlled by extended family ties. The northeast is characterised by political collectivism. People are controlled by authoritarian rule. And the southeast exhibits both forms of collectivism. The upshot is that while the indigenous Europeans have a Mars-Jupiter soul, which Spengler calls Faustian, the newcomers from the southwest bring with them a Mars-Venus soul, which Spengler calls Magian. This cultural contrast suggests the two groups will keep their distinct identities, separating themselves geographically, as we have discussed. Now, this assumes that the incomers do retain their Mars-Venus worldview despite moving quadrant. But if we look at the Scots, a people who, according to some legends, trace their ancestry back to Egypt, they might be said to have a Mars-Venus soul, both warlike and clan-based, and they haven't lost this despite millennia in northwest Europe, but remain very aware and protective of their distinct identity and separateness from the English. Now, although the triplicity doesn't determine the planetary pair of each quadrant, we can say that some planetary pairs are more resonant or less resonant with a given triplicity. So we saw in this table that the planets ruling the people of the northwest quadrant, Mars and Jupiter, are also both rulers of the fire triplicity. So we could say that the Europeans' Mars-Jupiter soul is particularly compatible with the fire triplicity that characterised their region, Europe, during the Age of Pisces. And in the southeast quadrant, China-India, we can see the Saturn-Venus soul of their cultures is similarly particularly compatible with the Earth triplicity, also ruled by Saturn and Venus, that characterise their region in the Age of Pisces. On the other hand, in the northeast and southwest, there is only a partial compatibility. In the northeast, there is just Saturn in common, and in the southwest, there is just Venus in common. And if we take a closer look, we see that the triplicities are either Jupiter-Mars or Venus-Saturn, along with a third planet, either Sun, Moon or Mercury. So the Jupiter-Mars people of the northwest quadrant are either fully compatible with their ruling triplicity when it includes Jupiter and Mars, or not compatible with it at all when it includes Venus and Saturn. And it's similar for the people of the southeast quadrant. They are either fully compatible when it's Saturn-Venus, or not at all compatible when it's Jupiter-Mars. But for the people and cultures of the southwest and northeast quadrants, they always have exactly one planet in common with the triplicity, so they are always partially compatible with it, but never fully compatible. So what does this mean for Europeans in the age of Aquarius, when the northwest quadrant is under the influence of water? Well, water's planets are Moon, Mars and Jupiter. So the Europeans' Faustian Mars-Jupiter Sol is actually compatible with water. This is something they can get used to. They have been accustomed to being a fire people, but it's equally natural for them to be a water people. And in fact, once they have made the adjustment, they should be more at home in the water environment than the Mena incomers, whose cultural soul is, as always, only partially compatible with it. This seems like a strength of the old Europeans in the age of Aquarius that should work in favour of preserving their identity and existence as a people. So we have assembled most of the ingredients for a dive into the water world of Aquarian Europe. But before we do that, let's take a detour to the Western Hemisphere and see how these ideas might map on to the region of the Americas and the Pacific. In this case, the division into quadrants doesn't look so obvious. Because we're covering a much wider range of latitude above and below the equator, and because the Earth is round, the lines are curved and not parallel. But even so, we can make a division that falls out pretty naturally. To the east we have the landmass of the Americas, and to the west we have the Pacific Ocean. And then the east is divided into North and South America, while the west is divided into the northern Pacific with the scattered islands of Micronesia and Polynesia, and the southern Pacific with Australia, New Guinea and the islands of Melanesia, which lie on the same continental shelf and whose people are culturally and genomically different from those in the north. Then the next question is how to assign triplicities for these quadrants during the age of Pisces. Well, one possibility is to use the same pattern as in the Eastern Hemisphere, with fire in the northwest, air northeast, earth southeast and water southwest. But nothing springs out from this. For example, Polynesia's world historical role might have involved exploration, but it's not obviously as warlike or creative as Europe, so fire doesn't seem to fit in the same way. Another possibility is to reflect it in a line down the middle of the Atlantic, making the Western Hemisphere a mirror image of the Eastern Hemisphere. In this case, fire is in the northeast quadrant, air in the northwest, earth in the southwest, and water in the southeast. Now this starts to make sense. North America has fire qualities like Europe. It has shown the same creativity, for example, Edison, the Wright brothers, the same drive to explore, going as far as landing on the moon, the same warlike qualities from the conquest of the continent to more recent militarism against a variety of overseas regimes. And then South America as water would be expected to be spiritual and a place of magic. Well, the Catholic faith is strong here, as well as syncretic occult religions like Santeria and Voodoo. South American literature is steeped in the genre of magical realism, with writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jorge Luis Borges, and Isabel Allende. And this is also a continent racked by political and social upheavals, suggesting Scorpio's energy of transformation. And then next, Polynesia in the northwest could be said to fit the air archetype. People here roamed across the ocean the same way that in Eurasia they roamed across the steppe. This was a region characterized by mobility and networks rather than control of territory, as people voyaged over great distances, settling the remote islands and communicating between them. And finally, in the southwest, Melanesia and Australia have a moderately good fit to Earth. While populations in Melanesia are objectively low density, they approach the territory's carrying capacity given the region's low intensity subsistence practices. And this is connected to a strong concern with land ownership, resulting in chronic conflict between neighbours. Social structure is somewhat rigid, based on clans and so-called big men, and these big men create prestige through massive feasts or participation in the Kula ring, a system of exchanging prestige objects, shell necklaces and armbands, suggesting the earth themes of production, wealth and fondness for luxury goods. So we can summarise with this table showing the triplicities assigned to the now 8 world regions and a brief indication of why that triplicity is appropriate. The 4 on the right for the Eastern Hemisphere are from Ptolemy's original model, and the 4 on the left for the Western Hemisphere are our extension of Ptolemy's scheme. Or we could think of this not as a set of 8 mirrored regions, but as a band around the Earth with just 4 regions, the 2 hemispheres joining up at each end. In any case, we have Europe, an assertive exploratory region expressing fire, and North America, an expansive dominant region also expressing fire. Eurasia, mobile, communicative, and Polynesia, vast, networked, both express air. MENA, emotional, religious, and South America, passionate, spiritual, both express water. And India, China, hierarchical, material, and Melanesia, structured, productive, both express earth. This diagram then provides an explanation of why Europeans became more energetic and high achieving in North America than they did in South America, where they merged somewhat with the indigenous populations. In North America, Europeans were going from fire to fire. They found an astrologically sympathetic environment and were able to reprise their old world feats in the new world. But in South America, Europeans were going from fire to water. The European fire spirit was doused by the watery environment of the new continent and created quietly mysterious otherworldly societies. Okay, let's return to the old world in the age of Aquarius, which looks like this. So as Europe turns from fire to water, the other quadrants are experiencing their own transitions, and just like in Europe, this might be producing social and psychological stresses as people feel that their world is changing. In China and India, the old earth civilizations are turning to fire. I don't think many people will be surprised by the idea that this region will take over from Europe as the new centre of innovation, creativity, militarism and exploration. Both India and China have space programs, and they and their neighbours are increasingly the high-tech workshops of the world. This chart shows China's revenue from patents, i.e. from other countries paying to use Chinese inventions, which is clearly accelerating. And this chart shows the fastest climbers in the Global Innovation Index, with China at the top, moving from 35 to 10 since 2013, and India coming up behind, moving from 66 to 38. And other top movers, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, also in the southeast quadrant. And this region could well give rise to global empires. China is already building overseas bases. This map from a research project I did a few years ago shows what a future Chinese empire could look like. It's based on the work of Peter Lewis, who found a pattern in the sizes of empires that can be used to predict the size of the next one. And it takes into account where China is already active and which areas will be strategically important to it. And an Indian empire might look similar. Turning to the northeast quadrant, here air is giving way to earth, meaning that the mobile societies of the Piscean age will be replaced by dense and settled ones. The new role of this quadrant will be as a focus for global production of energy, materials and manufactured goods. We can think of the steppes becoming dotted with vast Tartarian megacities, which will be both industrial centres and transportation distribution nodes on the high-capacity road and rail links that China is building with its Belt and Road Initiative. And as for the southwest quadrant, MENA, it is turning to air, representing communication, trade and exchange, the role of a global intermediary. So, for example, Dubai is emerging as a financial centre, an airline transfer point and a logistics hub, placing it at the heart of global flows of money, people and goods. The region is a conduit for the seaborne part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the turn to air-like mobility is also suggested by Saudi Arabia's NEOM project, with The Line, a narrow 100-mile-long futuristic city connected end-to-end by high-speed transit. Projects like these are turning the Arab world from a holy land of faith to a world of networks and information highways at the heart of global trade and travel. Very air. Now, it might be said the southwest quadrant is also the region of radical Islamists like ISIS, who seem to be more medieval than the creators of a new high-tech civilization of communication and exchange. But these groups, which are in any case repudiated by most governments of the region, are not actually throwbacks to medieval Islam, which was urbane, sophisticated and scholarly, carefully reconstructing the knowledge of ancient Greece, for example. Islamism, or Salafism, might be seen as a kind of ghost dance, a last-ditch effort to reassert core principles amidst the shifting sands of a major global transition from Pisces to Aquarius. If we take seriously the ideas of Oswald Spengler that Magian civilization has completed its life cycle, then Salafism would need to be understood as the kind of movement that marks the beginning of a new civilization. We see the same fanaticism in early Christianity, which destroyed heathen books and temples, as described in Catherine Nixie's book, The Darkening Age. If the analogy is correct, Salafism should mellow into a new source of guidance and inspiration for the movers and messengers of the future Middle East. So this is the picture for the old world, the world island, in the age of Aquarius, where I've suggested what each quadrant will mean specifically to the old Europeans. In the northwest is watery Europe, its role to do with spirituality and secret knowledge, no longer the king of the world, but possibly its high priest, no longer the source of creativity and action, but a reservoir of achievement for others to draw on. To old Europeans, it will be the source of historical memory and a mirror in whose landscapes and monuments they can catch a glimpse of who they are as a people and what legacy they have to represent to the world. In the northeast, Russia and Central Asia are the locus of production and of massive solid structure, cities and industries that are a mainstay of the world economy. For old Europeans, this region will be a supplier of consumption needs, but it may also be an anchor for the indigenous European way of life amidst the swirling floods of powerful newcomers. Russian Eurasians belong to a different Saturn-Jupiter civilization, but there is an affinity to old Europeans thanks to shared identity as fair-skinned peoples, so that preservation of aspects of old European culture in the East may help with preservation in the West. In the Southeast, China, India and their neighbours will be expanding their presence across the world and perhaps into outer space, discovering unthought of technologies and new possibilities for humanity. To old Europeans, they are a possible predator, encroaching, exploiting, building military bases, establishing trade flows that extract European knowledge and resources to their own advantage. But they may also be a patron, cultivating old Europeans' Faustian originality and independent thinking to refresh their technological programs, which will be in continual danger of stagnation thanks to the intrusive controlling governments of the Aquarian age. In the southwest, MENA is characterized by networks and exchange. For old Europeans, this region will be the conduit for innovations emerging in the East, managing access and setting prices and terms. In a world where they are neither the prime technological innovators nor in control of global trade and finance, old Europeans will rely on the brokers of the Middle East for the means to exist and build a future. Now let's home in again on Europe, which we expect to develop a post-rational ambience, spiritual, mystical, emotional, shaped by communal identity and allegiance. All of this is dislocating to the indigenous population, but not to the newcomers from the southwest quadrant, whom Spengler called Magian after the Magi, same word as magic, because of their existing esoteric, mystical worldview. The age of Aquarius is making indigenous Europeans the strangers and newcomers the continent's inheritors. Because of the change from fire to water, it is the indigenous people who will have to adapt to the newcomers and not the other way around. And with their traditional individualism, with their nuclear families, the old Europeans will be socially fragmented, while the newcomers present a united front thanks to their clans and religious faith. So it seems inevitable that the newcomers will thrive relative to the indigenous population and will come to dominate Europe politically, culturally and numerically. So this map we saw earlier is not going to stay like this. The blue areas, the white British areas, will shrink and the yellow areas will grow. I've built a computer model of this process based on two principles. First, the newcomers will have higher fertility than the white British. Second, when white British become the minority in a particular area, they will migrate to another area where they are still in the majority. And this is the result. After a few centuries, the white British occupy a series of enclaves within a majority newcomer country. The native British areas emerge as Cumbria and Northumberland, some of Lincolnshire, North Norfolk, Southend-on-Sea, Devon and much of Wales. This outcome doesn't vary much even if you change the model parameters a bit, so seems to be about right. The indigenous British will occupy a chain of cultural islands in a sea of newcomer culture. And this spread of the newcomers into indigenous areas is encouraged by the political and cultural elite, with headlines we've already seen, like British countryside is overwhelmingly white and needs more halal food. It is racist and colonialist. Diversity drive to make Britain's countryside less white. Rural areas have been tasked with coming up with strategies to attract more ethnic minorities. Country pubs and dog walking are problematic and have to go. So this is not just about people with a different complexion, it's about changing the culture, dismantling the indigenous British culture. Multiculturalism is an imperative, it has to be. And while all this seems counterintuitive and self-destructive, the underlying cause is the cosmic shift changing Europe's ethos. This is why it feels right to the opinion formers and decision makers. It's a change that's coming one way or the other. They're just restless people that want to get on with it. But this existence in cultural islands is not necessarily uncomfortable for an island people like the indigenous British. These patches of blue on the map will be reservoirs of the Jupiter-Mars instinct for independence and individualism within the Saturnian collectivist structures of the Aquarian age. They will be communities, but not communistic. It will be a case of individuals cooperating, which is the influence of Jupiter, not members of a hive, which is Venus, nor pawns in a bureaucratic hierarchy, which is Saturn. In these indigenous enclaves, there can be inner psychological freedom, even while our planet enters a long phase of unfreedom. The enclaves will condense and intensify the old Europeans' identity. It will allow them to keep a sense of distinctiveness in a shrinking, congested world, and Europeans work well under pressure. And Europeans aren't losing a part of themselves, it's just the scenery that's changing, and it's a question of getting used to it. Remember, the European cultural soul is as compatible with a water ethos as it is with a fire ethos. In terms of ruling planets, Europe's just going from the fire triplicities Mars, Jupiter, Sun to the water triplicities Mars, Jupiter, Moon. Mars and Jupiter are still resonant. The Faustian vibe is still there. It's just a case of swapping the Sun for the Moon, swapping the solar theme of shining outwards for the lunar theme of reflection, dreaming and turning inward. The only downside is this readjustment that has to take place, which is kind of a hump that old Europeans have to get over. So this diagram shows the degree of compatibility of different triplicities with the European collective soul. Well, fire and water are very compatible and appear as valleys, while earth and air are incompatible and appear as mountains. The old Europeans, represented by the blue dot, have sat nicely at the bottom of the fire valley, and they can sit equally nicely at the bottom of the water valley, but they would be uncomfortable on top of the earth and air mountains. So the problem is just the effort of climbing out of the familiar fire valley into the unfamiliar water valley. But once the old Europeans have done this, they'll be very comfortable with it. And I think we can see signs of this shift occurring already. The Overton window is moving. Thoughts and opinions that old Europeans would once have rejected are increasingly expressed and found attractive. So a shift of mindset that should only accelerate as we move deeper into the Aquarian age. Now, this shift from fire mindset to water mindset will exhibit the Phoenix principle, which is the principle that you have to break down the old before you can build up the new. So there will be a phase of disintegration, breaking down old fire-related institutions and values, followed by a phase of reorganization, building up new water-related institutions and values. We can illustrate it with this sine wave. Time proceeds to the right, and the vertical axis shows the civilization's vitality or fortunes. So the civilization is first weak and going downhill in the phase of disintegration. Then it is weak but improving in the phase of reorganization. After this comes the phase of flourishing, when it is strong and improving. Last, there is decline, when it is strong but weakening, as external conditions are starting to change again. So if we put in the world age, we expect the old Europeans' fortunes to follow this pattern in the age of Aquarius, and we could expect a similar pattern to have played out in the age of Pisces, when a corresponding adjustment would have been necessary. And the pattern will continue into the next world age, the age of Capricorn. Now let's put in the triplicity of the northwest quadrant in each age: fire, water and air. And we can add in some dates using a rough and ready figure of 2000 years per age. So let's start the age of Pisces around the time of Christ, the year 0. The period of disintegration lasted to around AD 500, as the Roman Empire slowly crumbled and eventually fell. This was followed by a clambering out of the resulting Dark Age to AD 1000, which led to the flourishing of European civilization in the High Middle Ages up to the Renaissance around 1500. This was Europe's cultural peak, the time of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, names that will resonate long after today's artists and writers have been forgotten. After that, Europe was still in good shape, but on the way down, advancing in capabilities, yes, because technology is cumulative, but declining as a civilization. And that brings us to 2000, to today, where we are again starting the phase of disintegration. And this should continue till 2500, after which things will turn up. And after 3000, the old Europeans will be flourishing again in another golden age. The upshot is that the age of Aquarius will see a period of income dominance in Europe starting in the next 100 years and lasting up to around AD 2750, while the resurgence of the old Europeans will begin sometime after AD 2500. And by the year 3000, they will have regained power and confidence and may achieve a new ascendancy in Europe. Okay, now we've seen that the difference between the fire triplicity and the water triplicity is that while both are ruled by Mars and Jupiter, the sun gets swapped out for the moon. So the sun is about power and enlightenment and carries the idea of what is visible and objective, things that are seen in Piscean Age Europe as the triumph of reason and mastery over peoples, nature and geography. The moon, on the other hand, is nocturnal, the light in the darkness. It is about the unconscious and carries the themes of memory and instinct, and also the themes of the collective unconscious and collective memory, the memory of a people. The moon is one of the rulers of the water triplicity because it is the ruling planet of the water sign Cancer, known as the nurturer, which itself brings in ideas of nurturing the family, hence family, ancestry and heritage. All this tells us that in the age of Aquarius, heritage is going to be important to old Europeans. They will cherish the legacy of their past, both material like cathedrals and ancient megaliths, and immaterial, i.e. traditions and legends. So during the Piscean age, much of Europe's heritage was actually destroyed. Christianity, a new religion, displaced the old gods and beliefs. Scholars belittled folklore and myths, which were forgotten or their full meaning was lost. Ancient monuments were knocked down and earthworks were ploughed into oblivion. The pagan emotional side of life lost its magic in the light of the sun, and people lost their connection to the land and its deep past. But as we enter the age of Aquarius, with Europe influenced by water and by the moon with its eerie light, these things are coming back into people's consciousness. In Britain, before, during and after the 1970s, there was a revival of folk music, Morris dancing and ancient ritual traditions. The Earth Mysteries movement explored ancient landscapes. Folk horror, like The Wicker Man in 1973, evoked Britain's dark past. There was a proliferation of books on folklore and ancient monuments, and membership boosts for the Folklore Society and the National Trust, and re-establishment of festivals at Stonehenge. And while this died away a bit in the 1990s, it's coming back again. So the transition to water is not smooth and steady. It's more like overlapping waves, surging and receding, but coming in further each time until the whole beach is underwater. And so in Aquarian Europe, the indigenous peoples in their isolated enclaves will maintain their heritage, collective memory and tradition, and not just as hobbies and interests, but as a core part of their culture and identity. Water is the element of blood, so the bloodline, ancestry and biological heritage, these will be part of it. And maintaining traditions, visiting ancient sites, celebrating revived rituals, these things will provide a connection to the ancestors, to the ones who were in Europe first, though now pushed aside, the ones who haunt these lands. You see, the danger is that Europe becomes a museum littered with monuments to a dead civilization. This is pretty much what happened when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain, or even before. Stonehenge and other monuments became just a bunch of stones. No one used them or cared for them anymore. There was a disconnect from Britain's heritage. This time, if the old Europeans are to continue existing as a people, they must keep the connection. The old Europeans only have a future if they have a past, meaning they need to own their past and keep it relevant. Take Britain's cathedrals. These are already turning into tourist attractions for foreign visitors, and that will be goodbye to a big part of Britain's history and identity. To ensure British culture is a real living thing, the indigenous people need to keep the cathedrals functioning, and that won't necessarily be as places of Christian worship, because, let's face it, the church is part of the problem, changing its values, abandoning its identity, practically apologising for its existence. And we can say that is because the church is a Piscean institution, and now we're entering the age of Aquarius, it's losing its purpose and relevance. But whether it's via a restored Christianity or with reimagined rituals such as at Stonehenge, the survival of white British as more than a racial category depends on the white British putting heritage like the cathedrals at the centre of their future way of life. They need to say, we own this, it owns us, this is what we are, this is what we do, and it is what we will continue to be and do. The indigenous British may no longer own the streets of London or Birmingham, but they can still lay claim to Britain's deep history. And this won't be easy. It won't be possible to save all the cathedrals. Some will be blown up, some will be burnt down, some will be converted into mosques. The very attempt to preserve an indigenous cultural identity will be under attack from efforts to erase or deny indigenous British heritage, saying, for example, that the Anglo-Saxons didn't and don't exist, and Shakespeare stole his plays from a black woman, and many other such cases. But the good news is that heritage, collective memory, ancestral connection, and all things like that are resonant with the vibe that is settling over Europe through the water sign of Cancer and its ruler the moon. And this vibe, which will only get stronger, will reinforce efforts to keep the memory of the British past alive. And we should not forget the role of Mars and Jupiter, also governing the water triplicity. Because of water's deep contemplative character, these planets' influence will turn inward. Jupiter's dominant individualism will encourage not rule over others, but rule over oneself, spiritual discipline. And Mars's vigour will be protective rather than aggressive. Old Europeans may develop a kind of monk-like resilience. Think of some kung fu master, controlled, quiet, reserved, philosophical, but with an inner strength, ready to respond decisively when needed. The ideal, the one that future indigenous Europeans will look up to, is the heroic guardian, the just defender. Now, let it be said, the new Europeans will experience the same water vibe, so will also emphasise heritage and memory, cultural traditions, the foundations of their faith. But the old Europeans, being a fuller fit to the water archetype, may take it back much further, perhaps to the last ice age, unravelling the wanderings of their people. So anyway, we have that in the age of Aquarius, when Europe is under this lunar water influence, cultural knowledge will be deep, dark and secret, concerned with complex structures, alchemical and mystical, all very different from the solar fire influence of the Piscean age, when knowledge was valued for shedding light and for being obvious, rational and transparent. But this turn to secrecy can be seen as a way for Europeans to cultivate independent thinking and free inquiry, despite the rigid, authoritarian, collectivist structures of the Aquarian age. So knowledge will be hidden because it needs to be hidden, hidden from repressive, dystopian, conformity-enforcing Aquarian governments. Old Europeans will fight authority secretly with spiritual rebellion, drawing strength from their past and its symbols. The new Europeans have some of these instincts and will also subvert Saturnian governments with their comprehensive religion and clan solidarity. But they are likely to fit in better and be more overtly successful and dominant because, although they're not Saturnian themselves, their Venusian disposition for detailed social moderation of personal conduct, think Sharia law, will help them cope with Saturnian surveillance and bureaucracy. Okay, so now let's think about some aspects of life for old Europeans under Aquarian and water influences, before going back to the future of the Western Hemisphere and then summing everything up. So specifically, we'll consider the issues of history, natural philosophy, spirituality, art and literature, and economics. So let's start with history, which will come to be understood in a watery Europe, not as upward progress, but as a repeating cycle. So in the Piscean Age, Europeans came to feel that the future is and should be better than the past, and that the theme of history is the continual improvement of the human condition through ingenuity and struggle. Which means that now, when people are getting the sense that Western civilization is in trouble, economically, intellectually, spiritually, they see this through the lens of collapse. You see, progress is seen as the normal condition. So when it gets interrupted, which we know happens, the fall of Rome and so on, this is seen as a collapse, an anomaly, a glitch, something went wrong. So now that Western intellectuals see their own civilization maybe stop progressing, they latch on to the idea of collapse, and we have collapsology and the collapse of complex societies, even the strange death of Europe. But these ideas reflect Piscean Age fire-oriented thinking. From an Aquarian water perspective, the loss of Europe's preeminence is not collapse, but winter. It is part of an eternal cycle, as natural and as necessary as night follows day. We can't have day all the time. There has to be a night when we sleep and dream. So the attitude that believes in progress looks like this diagram. When things fall apart, it's seen as a fixable problem. And when things go well, it's expected to last forever. After the fall of Rome, the medieval king says, "We can do better than that." And today the scholar is pondering where things went wrong. But with the mystical thinking inspired by the water triplicity, people will look at it in a different way. They will think in terms of a cosmic cycle, and they will have a sense of deep time and the rhythm of history and the long-term destiny of peoples. So they will look back on the glory days of Western civilization and say, well, that was summer. We had a wonderful time, but the leaves have fallen from the trees. Yes, one day spring will come and it will be lovely. But right now, this is winter, when the nights are long and the days are dark. And in winter, we wear winter clothes and do winter things, heritage, faith, contemplation, slumbering by the fire, and dreaming about what has gone and what will be. Okay, now natural philosophy, the laws of the universe. So water influence will shift Europeans from the reductionist scientific mode of thinking towards magical thinking, which is based on resonances between ideas. So science is about classification, objective relationships, repeatability, whereas magic is about analogy, metaphors, correspondence. This video's astrological analysis of Europe's future is an example. Planets and signs are associated with certain themes, and we weave them into a narrative to map out things we perceive maybe subconsciously. It's intuitive, not scientific, which to the fire-oriented mind means it must be wrong, but to the water-oriented mind means it could be right. Magical thinking embodies laws like as above, so below. The cosmic plan is a mirror of the human plan, not really testable, but a source of inspiration for making sense of things. Or Hermeticism, the idea of the cosmos as a living thing where everything is connected. Or Gnosticism, where science and theology are seen as the same thing, the laws of the universe being the properties of God. And some would say contemporary science is moving towards magical thinking, with things like chaos theory and strange attractors, or fractals and self-similarity, or the concept of emergence. Ideas that are about evocative patterns, not definite predictions like traditional science. And now turning to spirituality, the new importance of heritage means that we should expect old Europeans to evolve a religion relying on a sense of place, not beliefs and rituals that can work anywhere, but beliefs and rituals focused on the cathedrals and monuments left by the ancestors. This cover of John Michel's New View over Atlantis evokes that mingling of geography and spirituality, with its ley lines connecting churches, stone circles, earthworks, ancient lanes, and perhaps far-off pyramids from where, according to some legends, the British originally came. So a chain of sacred sites from many ages, representing the deep spiritual history of Britain's indigenous inhabitants. And this localized spirituality will be a rejection of the globalist ideals of Aquarian governments. So you see, the old Europeans with their Mars-Jupiter soul will want to retain their individualism, not become powerless proles in the Aquarian hierarchy, and drawing a sense of identity from connection to a particular territory is a way to do that. Aquarian society will be secular and urban, with huge megalopolises. And so the indigenous Europeans can go a different way by valuing little corners of nature that have some special magic. And since Aquarian governments will understand the threat and prohibit these practices, the old European religion will be an underground faith transmitted parent to child, with ad hoc rituals and small spiritual communities. Next, art and literature. Well, with old Europeans being a defeated, marginalised people, the core theme will be the tragic guardian, the trustee of a doomed legacy. The ideal would be not the triumph of the winner, but the stoicism of the loser. And thanks to the esoteric occult influence of water, the work of writers and artists will be symbolic, full of hidden messages and secret signs that can only be recognised by the initiated. And finally, in economic life, we know that we're expecting AI and other technology to take over many kinds of routine work. But just as on YouTube, people don't like AI-generated content, similarly, people in future will want things that have the human touch. So human work will be craft work. And Scorpio the Alchemist, part of the water triplicity, suggests the idea of esoteric specialist craft. So this could be a niche for the Northwest Quadrant. While the Northeast Quadrant is churning out mass production, the Southeast is inventing and exploring, and the Southwest is handling world trade. The Northwest Quadrant can focus on things that are handmade, bespoke, one-off, time-consuming and creative, joinery, blacksmithing, embroidery, painting, things like that. In short, Europe can be a luxury brand. So there you are, some random ideas about what life in Aquarian Age Europe will be like, particularly for today's indigenous Europeans. And now, before we finish, let's see what we can say about the future of the Western Hemisphere, where many people of European heritage now live. So we have this assignment of triplicities to quadrants, and we want to know how it will change in the age of Aquarius. Well, the simplest answer is that it will be the same as in the Eastern Hemisphere. Each triplicity shifts back one. So North America will become water, meaning it will experience the same challenges as Europe. Americans of European heritage will be surpassed by incomers from the Islamic world and from South America, both areas accustomed to the water triplicity and pre-adapted to the new situation. And that doesn't seem all that surprising, given that the US has been experiencing the same mass migration as Europe, and the newcomers show similar confidence and go-getting qualities. Then South America will become air, perhaps pointing to a new role in east-west communication, or even communication between Earth and space, as its equatorial regions are ideal for launching rockets. Pacific Polynesia will become Earth, which might seem strange for such a watery world, but could be appropriate if humans start to colonize the oceans, or if deep-sea mining makes this region highly productive. And Melanesia Australia will become fire, perhaps benefiting from proximity to India and China. Well, that's not particularly interesting and is perhaps disappointing to think that North America will just go the same way as Europe. So I've wondered if it might be that the triplicities change in a different way in the Western Hemisphere. For one thing, the landmass in the Western Hemisphere is oriented north-south rather than east-west, and it is half ocean, whereas the Eastern Hemisphere is almost all land. Perhaps this makes a difference. One possibility is that the triplicities change the other way, forwards, not backwards. So fire will go to earth, earth to air, air to water, and water to fire. Well, nothing stands out here. Does it make sense that the US will come under earth influence and be a region of massive productivity? Not really. If anything, it's been deindustrializing as we move towards the age of Aquarius. Its industries are high-tech and financial, more air than earth. Perhaps we could construct an argument. Capricorn, the ruler, say, signifies the US role as global hegemon, Taurus, its role as global wealth driver, Virgo, its provision of new technologies enhancing global well-being. But it feels forced, not in tune with the real vibe of the region, not like China becoming the new fire quadrant, which seems much more convincing. But that said, one implication of this alternate rule for changing triplicities is that while fire and water in the Eastern Hemisphere faced fire and water in the Western Hemisphere during the age of Pisces, in the previous age of Aries, earth and fire in the Eastern Hemisphere would have faced water and air in the Western Hemisphere. We could then argue that this is why the old and new worlds became connected in the age of Pisces and not in the age of Aries. It was a question of compatibility between these signs on each side, which helped not only Columbus but also the Vikings make the crossing. Now, if we go back to the age of Taurus before 2000 BC, the triplicities would have lined up again, air and earth on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, although mainstream history doesn't believe there was any contact in those days, alternative archaeologists do argue that Phoenicians or other traders from the Old World were in contact with America at this time, pointing to the mining of copper from Isle Royale in Lake Superior, and arguing that the amounts extracted were too large for just New World use and were being shipped to the Old World to feed its appetite for bronze. Well, if this approach is correct, it follows that East and West triplicities are again mismatched in the age of Aquarius, water-air versus earth-fire, suggesting that this will be a time when the cultural links between America and Europe will be broken. The two regions will no longer consider themselves part of the same civilization. But there's another possibility. Notice that when the triplicities change in the eastern hemisphere, the southern triplicities go directly north, as it were, moving up to the quadrants above, while the northern triplicities go south but also swap sides. So from Pisces to Aquarius, water and earth move up, while fire and air move diagonally down. Well, what if the Western Hemisphere turns this on its side, given the way the Western landmass is turned on its side? In this case, the Western triplicities would move directly east, while the Eastern triplicities would move diagonally west. In this case, the shift from Pisces to Aquarius would look like this. North America becomes air, while South America becomes earth, and Polynesia becomes water, while Melanesia becomes fire. So could the future of the US be air, not water, as in Europe? Well, we've noted that its high-tech industries are evocative of air, as is its role as a source of internet technologies driving global communication. And if its government and private space programs succeed in opening up space commercially, the US could become the conduit, the air-like Silk Road between Earth and space. So maybe, it would be nice for Europeans to think so, space could be an escape route for Westerners seeing their civilization transformed by large-scale migration and differential fertility. But that all said, Occam's razor and the similarity of developments in America with those of Europe suggests that the first option, that its destiny is the same, is the most likely. But let's keep an eye on things to see if one of these other possibilities proves more correct. There may be faint signs that the US is making different choices and pulling in a different direction from Europe. Okay, so let's sum up. Well, it's a bit of a triple whammy for the indigenous Europeans. First, the world is entering a new dystopian collectivist astrological age whose Saturnian character clashes with their Mars-Jupiter cultural soul. Second, Europeans are experiencing a traumatic readjustment as their continent loses its fire persona and turns to a very different water persona. And third, they are witnessing an influx of people pre-adapted to a water environment who are rapidly rising to power, influence and demographic superiority. Indigenous Europeans are losing their prestige, their homeland, their freedom and their way of life. And it's a cosmic shift like others that have happened before, the Kurgan invasions and so on. It's not just a mistake that can be corrected. That's like thinking, as the Roman Empire declined and fell, that it was just a question of getting better emperors. Then and now, it's bigger than one person. It's the flow of world history. And the world isn't going back. History doesn't have a reverse gear. But there are silver linings. Yes, it's painful for Europeans to lose their home, to see this map turn from blue to yellow as other peoples gain the ascendancy and impose their culture on the formerly European lands. But when Europeans are reduced to a subjugated minority, they will stick together. They will cherish their heritage and identity. Uniformity will be their strength. And though they may be losing their superpowers of warrior, creator, explorer, they will be gaining new superpowers or magical powers of the alchemist, the mystic, the nurturer. And the saving grace of Aquarius is its maverick energy, and indigenous Europeans can tap that energy with secret underground intellectual and spiritual resistance, keeping independent thought alive during the long centuries of Aquarian conformism. So yes, Europeans face a tough future, disempowered and marginalised in their historic heartland. But when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And you see, Europeans have been accused of many crimes during their heyday, often unfairly, but always ignoring the benefits they brought the world and the fact they were outnumbered among hostile peoples far from home. And in a world of Aquarian conformism, Europeans will find new motivation in guarding their traditions and flying under the radar until the world spirit is in tune with their Mars-Jupiter makeup once again. So, yeah, night is coming, but every night ends in dawn. So when will the world be in tune again with the individualist mindset of the Mars-Jupiter people? Well, I'd like to finish with this view of the coming astrological ages. So we have Pisces followed by Aquarius, and after that comes the age of Capricorn and then the age of Sagittarius. And I've put in some rough dates. Pisces ending round about now, Aquarius around the year 4000, Capricorn ending around the year 6000, and Sagittarius from then up to the year 8000. And I've put in the attributes of each sign, which will influence the character of the age. So we have Pisces the mystic, a water sign, Aquarius the maverick, air, Capricorn the ruler, earth, and Sagittarius the explorer, fire. And Aquarius and Capricorn are ruled by Saturn, while Pisces and Sagittarius are ruled by Jupiter. I've also put in the triplicity of the northwest quadrant in each age. So fire in Pisces, water in Aquarius, then air and earth. And also the ruling planets of the signs making up each triplicity. So as we've already seen, fire was Mars, Jupiter, Sun, and water is Mars, Jupiter, Moon, while air and earth are both Venus, Saturn, Mercury. And then I've given a 1 or 2 word summary of the kind of society we might expect in each age based on the signs' attributes. And lastly, I've suggested the implications for humanity's exploration of space and our transition to a multiplanetary species when we start to realise that it's not the Earth that's our home, but the solar system is our home. So the age of mystical Pisces was an age of faith. Think in Europe of the dominance of Christianity and the medieval abbeys, and later of science, beginning like Christianity as a new, better way of understanding the cosmos, and following the same path of gathering a priesthood and turning into dogma. This age was a good time for the Mars-Jupiter European people. Their ruling planets resonated with the Jupiter of Pisces and with their quadrants ruling triplicity, Mars, Jupiter, Sun. In terms of occupying the solar system, this was when humanity became a properly planetary species, bringing the whole Earth together into a single system and moving towards Type 1 on the Kardashev scale of cosmic civilizations. Next, the Saturnian Age of Aquarius, which we're now pretty familiar with. Dystopian government, authoritarianism, surveillance, but also a maverick underground. Space exploration will be energy intensive, requiring a complex infrastructure of spaceports and life support systems. So it will be too costly for ordinary people and will only be viable at scale. It will remain the preserve of governments or of big corporations that are easily identified, controlled and regulated. Although people will live and work in space, it will be through postings and assignments where every move requires authorization, for example, to take this lunar shuttle or live in that orbital habitat. Continuing to the age of Capricorn, this looks like it will be the age of world government, insofar as Capricorn is the ruler. The political scientist Ran Targapera has calculated from past trends that there will be a single world empire around AD 3800, not far off our date of 4000 for the start of the Capricornian age. Capricorn is also known as the builder, which we can take as meaning that this age will see the construction of a fully fledged space civilization. There will be permanent settlements in space, not just as outposts of Earth, but as functioning societies in their own right, where people are born, live and die. Since Capricorn is another Saturnian sign, we should still expect Earth and space to remain subject to top-down hierarchical control, though perhaps less oppressively than in the age of Aquarius. The Capricornian ruler is about rational authority rather than control freakery like Aquarius. Capricorn, being an earth sign, suggests this age will also be one of great production and abundance, thanks to the exploitation of space resources. As for Europe specifically, it will be under the air triplicity, whose planetary rulers are incompatible with those of the old Europeans. But by this time they may have severed their connection with Europe and become a diaspora, joining the exodus into space. Finally, after the year 6000 or so, the world will move into the age of Sagittarius, whose planetary ruler is Jupiter. And since Jupiter stands for self-rule, this will be a new age of individualism, at last resonating with the culture soul of the old Europeans, who by now will surely have found a new home somewhere else. The Jupiterian impulse for self-rule suggests that Earth and space governments will break up into a series of independent nations, the same way that with the Jupiter of Pisces, the Roman Empire fragmented into independent barbarian kingdoms that became the various nations of Europe. In space, the new independence-oriented character of the age implies that technology will have advanced to the point that private citizens can fly around in their own spacecraft. Think Han Solo in Star Wars. And in accordance with Sagittarius's explorer ethos, humans will reach every planet and satellite, and they will be able to found self-governing colonies in remote parts of the solar system, away from the intrusions of state bureaucracies. And the old Europeans should be out there somewhere, pioneering, problem-solving, and beginning to dream of the next step, reaching for the stars.